It took me years to start thinking about walking away from politics. I was really driven by my personal connection to the work. I had an opportunity to take some downtime that I had never had in my life, and I took basically 6 months off to think about what I wanted to do next that wasn't working on politics and working on immigration because I was so exhausted. I think there's a lot of people who had worked in progressive activism for years who basically left around the time of the Biden administration because we were burnt out and exhausted.
I feel like we hear more and more about burnout. We're hearing more about rising anxiety. We are seeing athletes and celebrities take breaks for mental health. So how do we want to think about burnout, anxiety, the emotional and mental load when you're working in the social justice sector, especially when you have a personal connection to what you're fighting for? From the UCLA Labor Center, we bring you Rework. I'm Veena Hampapur, and I'm joined today by my friend George Chacon, who's Deputy Director of the Dream Resource Center. Thanks for co-hosting with me today, George.
It is my pleasure, Veena. Thank you so much for inviting me to your space, and I just can't wait to talk a little bit more about our guest.
So in today's episode, we speak with Ainee Athar about her pathway into immigrant rights work and later into climate justice work.
These days, Ainee lives in the Bay Area, but she's originally from Pakistan.
When I was 2 years old, my family decided to move to the United States. We are part of a religious community in Pakistan called Ahmadi Muslims, and Ahmadis are highly persecuted and experience a lot of violence and discrimination.
Annie's family moved around quite a bit in the 90s, and eventually when she was 7 years old, they settled down in a suburb of Houston.
I grew up in a neighborhood in Southwest Houston called Alief. It's a common pit stop for recent immigrants. And there were also families who'd lived there for a long time that were Black and Latino. When I was in, I think, the 3rd or 4th grade, we had this day where the school was putting up flags in the cafeteria of all the countries represented by the student body population. And I remember going to the cafeteria and there being over 60 flags, hanging up on the ceiling.
Ainee enjoyed the diversity in her school and neighborhood, but there are also concerns about safety.
I spent time at the mall. I spent time, hanging out at Starbucks and doing kind of just typical kid activities. But there was that kind of undercurrent of, honestly, like violence happening in that suburban community that was always at the back of people's mind. Because I came from this South Asian family where we were kind of expected to keep our heads down, I was sheltered from a lot of that, but I heard a lot about it from my friends at school who were kind of in the middle of it all.
Ainee was just a kid when September 11th happened. She was 10 years old, but she noticed a change afterwards.
When it comes to living in Alief, I was one of many Pakistani and South Asian students. After September 11th, there was definitely, even in that community, a shift. I remember students suddenly telling me that their parents didn't want me to talk to them anymore, that their parents had told them, you cannot be friends with Muslim kids anymore. I didn't really say anything and I didn't talk to those students again, but it was just confusing.
Ainee enjoyed reading classic dystopian novels like 1984 and Brave New World. In middle school, she started noticing how opportunities were different for her classmates.
When I was in 2nd grade, I was put in the gifted and talented track, and there were Black students, there were Latina students, and Asian students. There weren't a lot of white people that lived in Alief, so there weren't that many of those. But by the time we got to around 7th or 8th grade, I looked around and I realized that almost all the Black and Latino students were gone. There were so many smart kids that I grew up with who ended up dropping out of high school or not getting to college or getting involved with things like dealing drugs or gang violence. When I was in middle school, I got into competitive speech and debate. And it was another glimpse for me that was pretty important around inequality. You would go to these contests and see wealthy kids from wealthy schools and the amount of support and resources they had. They would get to go to fancy training camps. They would stay at nice hotels. They would have the support of their parents who were volunteers. We were just like a group of very ragtag students in our crew, but we were very focused and determined and had some great coaching from teachers at the school. So we were often quite successful.
Ainee's awareness of inequalities sparked an interest in social change.
I grew up feeling very powerless, and I grew up watching a lot of people around me be very powerless because of the circumstances they were in. To hear about some of the home lives of my friends and the experiences they were going through with their families not being safe, as well as the experiences that I was having, was a really big catalyst for wanting to do something positive for the world. My own family experienced their own sorts of instability because we were very poor. We were struggling with our immigration case, and my mom could not work legally growing up. So I remember her taking these kind of under-the-table jobs at kiosks at the mall or taking care of people's children for a living.
When Ainee was in high school, her family's H-1B application was rejected.
There was nothing that we could ever point to and say that this was the reason it was rejected. But we do know that the scrutiny around Muslim men really changed after September 11th. There were many applications that were kind of just arbitrarily denied among South Asian applicants. And I think some of that factored into the ultimate rejection of our H-1B case. But we also had family members who experienced, for example, being put on lists and investigated and things like that.
It's because of 9/11 that we created, the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, departments that to this day are impacting communities in a negative sense. If there is that political will, a lot of things can change in the structure and the systems that we have in our government. There's so much work left to be done in order to address that.
Ainee's family decided to apply for asylum.
My parents reassured me that this was just almost like a formality, like it was a done deal. So while I was nervous, I was also relying on them and really, believed them as a child that this would be the way we become citizens and that this limitation that kind of showed up in all sorts of ways in our lives would be lifted. But they did hide the extent of what was going on with our family because, like any parents, they don't want to burden their children with these, difficult facts. When we were preparing for the case, I heard all these stories from both my parents and some other community members who were Ahmadi about the extent of the violence and discrimination that they faced in Pakistan. Some of the stories were pretty jarring, and it was very shocking to hear all of that. It really clicked for me what it meant if we were to be deported and to go back to that country.
The uncertainty her family was facing really took a toll on Ainee's emotional well-being.
Honestly, in high school, I became very depressed. I think the stress of it all was pretty significant, but, no one really knew kind of what to do because a kid was stressed out about something like this, and I didn't really know how to put into words what I was experiencing either. But it was pretty detrimental to my mental health to realize what was going on and what were the stakes if this situation didn't go right. My family's community and social life was around the mosque, and no one really talks about challenges that they're facing. So no one was really talking about the challenges that they faced as immigrants, for example, after September 11th. And so while I grew up in this community where all these people, had all these things culturally in common and were bonding over religion, I felt at odds because we were going through this very significant experience and it didn't really seem like we were supposed to mention anything. My view of the world, I think, became very small, and I felt very frustrated about that. I was, 16, 17 years old, thinking about my own future and wanting to go to college, wanting to think about what career I could have and what kind of adult I wanted to be. And I felt so stymied. My choices were really limited by how our family's immigration case was playing out. I didn't even know if I could go to college. It felt like everything in my life had kind of come to a little bit of a halt.
Ainee ended up attending UT Austin after graduating from high school, but her family's immigration challenges became a bit more complicated.
Our asylum case had initially been denied, and even the denial was kind of confounding to a lot of the lawyers that we saw. The success of your case, unfortunately, can depend on something as simple as who your judges assign. And so we saw a judge initially that had close to something like 97% rejection rate. When I was a sophomore in college, we were in the appeals process, and I was not really thinking that much about the case. I was trying to enjoy my college experience. And I woke up one morning to a call from my sister. She was hysterical on the phone. ICE had come to our house in Houston and arrested my parents. There was a lawyer who had made a mistake in one of the papers that they had filed in the appeal. And I decided to essentially file deportation proceedings. We didn't know what the mistake was until this all happened, so we didn't have any kind of chance to correct it. My parents were detained and held in a facility for about 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were pretty much a blur. It was such a traumatic and chaotic situation. All these reassurances that my parents had given me, I realized, were just their best efforts into making us feel better, and they didn't reflect the reality of how the immigration system actually worked. ICE wanted to detain all of us, and they had a warrant for me. I was told by our lawyers not to go to class. When I tried to communicate what I was experiencing and what I was going through to the university administration, they treated it as if it was a criminal matter, and they told me that they would not provide any kind of accommodations because it would be seen as some kind of obstruction of the legal proceeding. Those 3 weeks were just kind of spent in fear. I always call this kind of episode to be like an example of like state-sponsored terrorism. It feels like terrorism, right? To knock on someone's door in the middle of the night and drag away like a mother and a father to a jail cell indefinitely because of a clerical error in some paperwork, and to tell their kids that they want to arrest them too.
Ainee's parents were released from detention, but that wasn't the end of their immigration issues.
The Immigrant community really stepped up. They helped my parents find a new lawyer and also helped them put together kind of the resources they needed to start a new legal strategy and to get them out of detention. Our lawyer was someone who's part of the Immigrant community and has done a lot of these kinds of asylum cases. Really, that situation was just the beginning of what would kind of transpire over the next 7 years of fighting this case and having active orders of deportation against us. I was subject to ICE check-ins, which meant that they would call me randomly when I was in class, and I would have to step out and answer the call. I remember once missing a call because I was taking a shower, and I just had a total meltdown in my apartment, thinking that that law enforcement was going to show up guns blazing and drive me out of my house. It was a pretty big strain, and I considered dropping out at several points.
Ainee thought about leaving school, but ultimately decided to stay. She was able to find ways to make sense out of her experiences.
I studied political anthropology at UT, which was a major at the time that focused on social movements, on public policy, and on critical race theory. I kind of wanted a why to why my family was experiencing this and why some of my friends were experiencing the things that they had gone through. Going Through those studies, especially once my family had deportation proceedings filed against us, was very valuable in helping me make sense of the world. And it was also really helpful in showing me how change has happened historically in this country when it comes to organizing and social movements and influencing policy and government.
Ainee also joined an undocumented student group on campus, and she began sharing her story publicly.
You know, the university is not supporting you, and you're fighting this battle largely alone and in isolation. I felt like I was living life behind a glass wall. Instead of being able to get together with other people who know exactly what you're going through, and we could have fun with each other in a way that sometimes we couldn't with other people who we'd have to explain these limitations that we were facing in our lives. Ultimately, we played a role in organizing Texas undocumented youth to help pass DACA. I had also started to do a lot of work where I would travel the country and share my family story. It was really empowering to work on campaigns and to work with the student group because you were kind of in control of your own destiny instead of waiting for other people to come save you. After I graduated, I joined an organization called Forward US, which is a national immigration reform group. So I threw myself kind of full force into advocating for immigration policies.
Around 2017, Anee's family was granted asylum.
My first reaction was that it was pretty anticlimactic. It feels very strange to have gone through this very traumatizing and egregious experience, all for it to end with someone handing you a piece of paper in a courtroom and saying, you're free to go. For a couple of minutes, my mom, she didn't really believe it. She kept asking, is this it? Is this it? I felt a huge sense of relief and all this excitement immediately afterwards. But ultimately, that excitement gave away to, honestly, to reality, which was just because we got status doesn't mean the challenges ended. We still had a low income. There were all these ways in which we were behind. That includes a lot of things that people probably don't think about. So, for example, if you're someone who didn't have access to healthcare for years, as my family didn't, there's probably all sorts of health issues. Because we got a green card through asylum, there's a lot of different kinds of stipulations. So I still have not gotten to travel outside the country, even though I've had asylum status for about 6 years at this point. And you just kind of get a sense of all those things that you missed out on. Rebuilding your life after going through that experience takes years at a time. I would still say I'm in the process of kind of rebuilding the life that I want, and my family is also in that process. It's a lot of sense making of how my 20s went and how my childhood went. I'm also obviously very grateful the fact that I do have status when some of my friends still don't. I am able to think about the future in a way that I haven't been before, and it's something that takes a lot of practice and a lot of work to not just think about where you need to be in the next year or the next two, but to start thinking about where would I want to be in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. It's definitely like a stretch exercise, and you have to kind of force yourself to do it.
After receiving asylum, Ainee moves to the Bay Area to work in philanthropy. Eventually, she decided to take a break and really rethink her path.
Working on something like immigration under the Trump administration burnt a lot of people out mentally, physically. It was traumatizing, if I'm being honest, to wake up every day to a new crisis that affected some of the most vulnerable people in our country. So I wanted to work on things and have, honestly, a little bit of emotional distance from the work that I was doing. So I decided to not work at all, not apply for any jobs, and really just think about what I found interesting. And I had always been interested in environmental issues. I'd always followed climate science. After working on something like immigration and being so directly involved, there was nothing I could do next that wasn't mission-oriented. It had to be something that I felt very profoundly about. And climate change is the existential threat of not only our generation, but all the generations to come.
Just to talk a little bit more about burnout. I mean, we all have it, right? And that pivot to addressing climate change was pretty big.
One thing I noticed about Ainee is that she questions what she sees around her from a young age. And then when she gets older, she's questioning herself, and she chooses to actually take a break from work and think about what she really wants to do. And that really stood out to me because that's something I've heard people talk about, but maybe not actually do.
I really do admire her on that. It's pretty awesome.
These days, Ainee is a student at the business school at Stanford.
One of the reasons I decided to go to business school was because I realized I was very entrepreneurial. I figured that if I could get into a really good MBA program, I would go back to school. And if not, I'd just kind of figure out another way to transition into the climate space. Luckily, I did end up getting into a great program that is tackling both climate science and technology and policy all at the same time. I think the way that people talk about it and think about it is that the world is just going to get wiped out or everyone is going to live in peace and prosperity. And the reality is existing forms of inequality will become amplified in the coming years. It's not a case where we're all in this together. It's a crisis that is going to affect vulnerable people the most. It's not a question of can we solve it? It's a question of, can we solve it in a way that's inclusive of as many people as possible? Because the trajectory that we're on right now is that wealthy nations and wealthy people will not experience the brunt of it, but the rest of the world will. Part of the dynamic of being a directly impacted person in advocacy and philanthropy and all these kinds of industries is that a lot of the time the show is not being run by people who know the issue the best, know the people the best, know how to work on this the best. And I think over time, I've gotten more and more courageous and confident in being able to say, yeah, I don't have the same credentials as you, but I know that I can do this. I know I can fix this problem or take on this project or be in charge of this thing. I don't have the same profile as 90% of my class at Stanford, and that can be very isolating, but it also helps me look at problems in a very different way. Climate change, it is this opportunity to really transform the way that we do really basic things and the really fundamental aspects of our economy. And the power and the value I see in that is that we can build industries and policies in a way that are very inclusive and very equitable if we do it right. Unlike working on certain other social issues that feel very stuck, like immigration, in the climate space, what's really rewarding is that we're often looking ahead, and this opportunity to kind of get to build something new is very exciting to me, given that I have lived most of my life and career playing defense.
One thing I really struck me when listening to Ainee's story is just her ongoing reflection of the world happening around her.
I was also just noticing her spelling out this emotional journey that she goes through.
Right. And especially when she was young, it kind of drew me back when I was young and thinking about things like, tests and friends while, all this big earth-shattering stuff is happening around me.
Yeah. We say things like kids are resilient, and I'm not saying they're not, but she really explains what it's like to grow up and live feeling a lack of agency, a lack of control. I think sometimes when we're talking about an issue or a problem someone's having, we can get caught up in the facts and what needs to be done versus the emotional toll it can take in the short term and in the long term.
Right.
How it can continue to impact you and the way you see life and what you choose to do, I think is really important to talk about because these last few years have been...
It's been hell. It's been hell. We can say it. We can say that. It's been one for the books for sure.
Yeah. And I think we also see the positive impact of community and what it's like when you actually get space to process, to be seen.
If there's any younger listeners out there listening, it's okay to talk about these things and you don't have to go it alone. It's always good to have a community with you.
When you're a youth activist in the immigrant rights movement, you travel a lot and you share your personal story. and this very traumatic set of experiences that you've had. And now I'm in this place where I'm kind of getting to rewrite a little bit about how I want the story to go. And it's still very difficult because I get frustrated sometimes at being seen as this very like resilient and strong person. I think that's true, and I'm proud of what I was able to do under the circumstances that I faced. But I would rather live in a world where people don't have to be strong like that, rather than take away that there are millions of people who face a tremendous amount of adversity. There's a lot of talent in this country that's being held back from solving some really important problems in our world. And just because you hear a couple of stories here and there about someone who's overcome the odds doesn't mean that the odds aren't real, you know? And so I feel a little different now about how I share my story and who I want to share it with, if that makes sense. Directly impacted people become activists because sometimes we're looking for a little bit of control over our own destiny. And I have a lot of friends who are undocumented and they're in their mid-30s. They're thinking, am I ever going to get to live life like a normal person? And they're having to find their own ways of controlling their own destiny. It's quite a difficult situation to be in for people who are still undocumented and don't know what the future entails. But I think that all of us have to find our own kind of locus of control in our lives, especially when we come from these communities. And whatever that is for you, try to find it, because feeling disempowered or as if you have no control over your life and really sitting in that feeling is quite destructive to your mental health. So find whatever it is that helps you feel like you are, in charge of your own destiny and be very unapologetic about it.
A special thanks to Ainee Athar for sharing her story. You're listening to Rework, a production of the UCLA Labor Center.
This episode was produced by Veena Hampapur, George Chacon, and Saba Wahid. Sound design and editing by Veena Hampapur. Mixing by Aaron Dalton. Stay tuned for more new episodes, and until next time, rethink, rework.